Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Teresa Welsh. I'm a senior reporter with Devex based here in Washington, D.C. We're really excited to have you along today for the third in our event series presented by Open Society Foundations focused on Latin America. I'm joined now by Devex Editor-in-Chief Raj Kumar, who's going to be moderating today's event. Raj, nice to see you.
Great to see you, Teresa. And I'm excited about the event today.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about who you're going to be speaking with.
So this is our third in the series of conversations we've been doing on Latin America. And today's newsmaker is Santiago Levy, who is one of the preeminent economists in the region. He's widely known across the region and has an incredible history of work as an observer. Now he's at the Brookings Institute, where he's a senior fellow in their Global Development and Economy program. He's also the president of the Latin America and Caribbean Economic Association. But I think a lot of people know him in our community, in the development community, because he is the really architect of the Progresa Oportunidades program in Mexico. And that program was one of the very first conditional cash transfer programs in the world. So it's going to be exciting to get a chance to hear from him on how he sees some of the kind of innovations in social programs and policies that are possible given the moment we're in Latin America.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so relevant, of course, because of the pandemic. And there are, unfortunately, so many debt crises happening in Latin America, such little fiscal space. Governments don't have the finances to meet the needs of the population. But of course, the population is in great need. Latin America is the region hardest hit by the pandemic, although, obviously we're all experiencing the effects, but there's just such complexity happening in the region. And as we explored in our previous conversations in this series, prior to the pandemic, there was lots of social upheaval, lots of protests in the street, having to do with democracy, governance issues. And all of this really is just so intricately woven together. And now we're seeing the effects of the pandemic. So it'll be really fascinating to see, what Santiago has to say about the moment we're in right now and how he sees the way forward as well.
Yeah, and especially agreed, and especially as someone who has been in government, right? He was in Mexico's government. It's going back 2 decades, but he had senior roles in the finance ministry. And I'll just read a couple of things that he worked on, because it's an impressive history as a person in government, where he, as I mentioned, was the main architect of Progresa Oportunidades, which is Mexico's incentive-based health, nutrition, and education program for the poor. He also worked on managing the transition from generalized to targeted subsidies. He promoted legal reforms for decentralizing resources to the states and municipalities. He helped to set up the pay-as-you-go to the capitalized pension system in Mexico. He developed a regional plan to develop Mexico's southern region. He drafted and negotiated 6 budgets with Congress. He was responsible for health provision services to 45 million people, and on and on. So I think he has seen in these roles in the finance ministry there in Mexico kind of the power of government, what policy reform can do. And at a moment like this, when we're feeling so constrained and Latin America is looking at such bad results, both health and economic, out of the pandemic, I'm really eager to see what he thinks can actually be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And, he took that wealth of experience in the Mexican government to the IDB after that. The Inter-American Development Bank held a role there as vice president of sectors and knowledge, which really was focused on knowledge sharing. So taking that experience that he had in Mexico and, trying to see how that might be relevant in other countries around Latin America. Because as I'm sure he'll probably chat about, there are lots of similarities across the region in terms of high rates of informality and all of that. The region does have sort of a centralized list of challenges that many countries are trying to overcome.
Absolutely. And after my conversation with Santiago Levy, I'll be joined by Mario Arriagada, who is a senior program officer at the Open Societies Foundations, who's supporting this event. And I'm eager to hear from Mario as well, because these are many of the very issues that the Open Society Foundations works on in the region. So we'll be having a conversation, and then I'll see you again at the very end of this discussion, and we'll talk about how it went.
All right. Excellent. Thanks so much, Raj. Really looking forward to the conversation.
Me too. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Santiago Levy. Santiago, it's so good to see you. Thank you for taking some time to be with us today.
My pleasure, Rob. Thank you for inviting me.
So it's kind of a critical moment in Latin America, and you obviously have a bird's eye view of the whole region. You've spent decades working on economic policy and development policy in the region. I'd love to just start with your take on where the region, a diverse, big region, lots of countries at different levels of development, but where do you see the region overall right now at this moment in the pandemic?
To be quite frank, it's in pretty bad shape. I don't think the region was in such a complex situation as it perhaps was in the 1980s when we had the big debt crisis. The reasons then were different: macroeconomic mismanagement, high debt levels, insolvency, inflation, macroeconomic crisis, and all that. But by the end of the 1980s, the region was in pretty bad shape. Then we had 3 decades of, if I may say so, mediocrity, but not terrible. But now my reading of the region is that it really is a sequence of factors aggravated by COVID are putting the region in perhaps the most complex situation it's been in the last 3 decades.
Yeah, because even that period you're talking about where there was mediocrity, at least there was growth, right? Commodity prices globally were up. Latin America saw significant growth over many of those years. And obviously, again, it's a very diverse region, depends a lot on each country. But you think now is an even more challenging moment than what we've seen before?
It is, because I called it mediocrity because, yes, there was growth, Raj, but most of the growth that occurred in Latin America, it was either driven by international conditions, events in China, commodity prices, or because there was investment and accumulation of labor. Latin America is distinct from most other regions of the world in which the last 3 decades, there was zero productivity growth in the region as a whole. Zero productivity growth. So that's a very mediocre performance. But it was accompanied, at least by, on the whole, with exceptions, relatively good macro management, much better than in the 1980s. So inflation was down, exchange rates were relatively stable. There could be some growth from investment and from investments in education. Not spectacular because no productivity, but not unstable. COVID has shaken that pretty badly because to the problems that we had before COVID, now we have to add the sequence of COVID. And the macro is very much damaged by COVID. Debt to GDP ratios pretty much across the whole region have increased. Countries have eaten up pretty much all the fiscal space to do any countercyclical policy. And in addition, depending on which country you look at, countries have lost about 1.5 years of education.
Yep.
That's a terrible legacy. And the level of polarization and the politics of the region has become extremely complex, which makes it very difficult to design policies to find a path out.
Yeah, as I've been saying, it's a diverse region, yet if you look across it, it's almost uniformly fairly bad circumstances in every country. Even countries like Chile, which historically have been a bulwark of growth and stability, find themselves in this kind of political polarization that is so endemic to the whole of the Americas, including here in the United States. So I guess before we get into what can be done about it, you talked about how there's less fiscal space. Governments have kind of spent what they can. A lot of them are commodity driven in terms of government revenues, right? They're very tied to oil prices or mining industries. What can they do? Or when you look at that fiscal space question, can they borrow a bit more? Is there still some room left to kind of go and do something big now? Or do you feel at this point they have to shift into more of an austere perspective as governments?
From the fiscal point of view, very few countries have any space. Perhaps Mexico, because it actually did very little as a result of the pandemic, could, if they wanted to, do some kind of countercyclical policy to spur growth. But when you say something big, Raj, I think that we shouldn't be thinking about macroeconomic policy. If there are countries and governments who want to do something big, what they should really do is to begin to tackle the underlying forces and problems that were there before COVID that implied that for 2.5 decades, the region didn't grow, productivity didn't grow. And one additional factor in the region, right, very important, that it kept the region being one of the most unequal regions of the world, if not the most unequal, depending on how you measure. So the underlying trends that explain, even before COVID, a lot of this political polarization and uncertainty has to do with the fact that for a large segment of the population of Latin America, growth didn't mean that much. And there was not a lot of social inclusion as a result of growth. And the underlying issues of the region haven't really been tackled. After the 1990s, after the lost decade of the 1980s, in the 1990s, we did tackle the macro issues. We began to have independent central banks. We had much more prudent fiscal policy. We had flexible exchange rates, much better inflation targeting. the macro on the whole was well managed. What we didn't do is the underlying microeconomic structural factors that have impeded growth to be more vigorous and productivity to increase more, and at the same time for more social inclusion. These factors are.
So what are some of those? Obviously, a major factor in the region that maybe is getting to what you're describing is the level of informality, the high rates of people who have jobs that are not part of the formal system. They're not paying taxes into the system through their paycheck. They're not getting social benefits through their employment. What are some of the examples of the things that have been missed in that period?
So you put your finger precisely where it should be placed. If you think about Latin America, the distinctive feature about Latin America is such high levels of persistent informality. And I think of informality as the manifestation of deeper problems. It's kind of the symptom of the disease. It's not really the disease, it's the manifestation of the disease. Just to give some numbers, for the region as a whole, more than 50% of the labor force is in the informal sector. And for the region as a whole, more than, depending on the country you look at, 80-90% of all firms are actually informal firms. So we're talking about, at least half of the population that is not well served by the current system of health, pensions, unemployment insurance. They have very little protection against risks and shocks, like in the case of COVID. Yes, there have been some efforts done to increase transfers to the subset of the population that is poor through Progresa type programs, and that helped. But that didn't solve the underlying problems in the labor market, having to do with very old regulations that Latin America imported from Europe in the mid 20th century that have never worked and that continue to be there and are in a way frame the way firms and workers interact, are at the basis of the social process and the production process. That doesn't work well. And if the macro is fine, that's good, but the underlying structural foundations of inclusive growth are not there. And that hasn't been laid, and that's why the region underperforms.
And how do we make that transition? Because if I understand it well, it's, the cost of employing people formally is so much significantly higher than hiring someone informally that many businesses just wouldn't be economic if they tried to formalize. And that's why so many smaller businesses don't. How can the government help to facilitate that transition? Because the inequality has gotten worse. You say productivity is down, poverty is up. There are more people who simply need to put food on the table and will work for low wages and will work under bad conditions. How do you make that transition to a more just labor force?
So that's an excellent question, Raj. I think this is my thinking after being around, thinking about this issue for more than 2 decades, is that we need to rethink the Latin American welfare state. We need to make a structural change, a structural break with the way the welfare state was founded. As you mentioned, Ram, it was thought of as, for salaried workers, we're going to have all these benefits, health, pensions that are going to be paid by the firms that hire them. We're going to pile up on that minimum wages, and we're going to pile up on that restrictions that firms cannot dismiss workers. And that was a cornerstone of the Latin American welfare state. That welfare state failed. It began in the mid 1920s, in some countries a little bit earlier, and almost 8 decades later, it has not delivered the results that we expect. So it's failed. Einstein used to say that the definition of insanity is to do the same thing again and again and expect a different result. So to your question, I think we need a conceptual break in the way we think about the welfare state. We need to redesign it away from a labor-based welfare state in the sense of workers that are in firms get it, workers that are not in firms don't get it, and think of, why don't we deliver health benefits independently of what people are doing in the labor market and regardless of what firms are doing? Britain is an excellent example. Canada is another example. New Zealand is another example. Countries in the world outside of Latin America have done this, and they don't have this informality problem. This has implications for pensions. It has implications for minimum wages. It has implications for labor regulations. It has deep implications for firms. One little piece of data is interesting. Almost 1 out of every 2 workers in Latin America works for himself or for a family firm with 2-3 people. So you have half of the labor force working as if it was the 18th century on their own or in a family firm. So really, you have to think about the underlying structure is completely outdated.
And you can imagine that the logic of that, Santiago, is that these workers feel they probably can't trust working for another firm where so much of their labor is so undervalued, and the benefits of the economic activity go to the owners of that firm or go to the managers of that firm. And so they have to stay very small scale to capture what little rent there is in their economic activity.
Trust is a factor, and yes, and many of these firms will actually keep to themselves because they don't trust the judicial system. They don't trust making businesses with other firms because they will not be able to collect on receipts. Banks don't lend to them because the judicial system makes sure that maybe they don't get the collateral in case that there's a default on the loan. So trust is part of the problem. And yes, malfunctioning judicial institutions are part of the problem. But in addition, part of the problem is that we sometimes set wages or regulations in ways that the productivity of the firms cannot support them. And therefore, the only way that the firms survive is by being informal. I'll give you an example. In Honduras, the minimum wage is set at the 60th percentile of the wage distribution. So it's 60% of workers earn less than the minimum wage. And if you went to the firms that are higher than and you said, no, you've got to pay the minimum wage, those firms would bankrupt. They don't have the productivity to pay. So certainly you want to raise the income of workers. But if you do it through a mechanism that is not suitable for the country, you get the result of what you get.
Santiago, the mechanism you're talking about, if I understand you well, which are state-sponsored welfare programs like the one that you were the architect of, the famous Progreso Oportunidades in Mexico, where people got conditional cash transfers. If their kids went to school, they got health and nutrition benefits. Those kinds of programs that you allude to that exist in other places in more advanced economies, don't they ultimately require a much higher level of taxation as a percentage of GDP? And so as I think about our audience watching this, people who work where you used to work at the Inter-American Development Bank, where you were a vice president for years, or at the World Bank or at USAID or the UN, at the NGO community, when they're thinking about how do they tackle this really severe root cause issue in the region, what can they do when these are countries that the taxation levels are quite low, there's low trust in government, and to do the things you're talking about, public pension, public health care, cash transfer programs would cost significant amounts of money for a stretched fiscal space?
Yes, you're again putting your finger right where it should be put. We are a region that taxes very little if you think about tax burdens, tax collections to GDP ratios. If you compare the region with other regions of the world, we're a region that taxes very little. Part of it has to do with evasion, and part of it is associated with informality. Part of it is with malfunctioning institutions that change taxes. So yes, as we rethink the Latin American welfare state, we have to rethink the fiscal foundations of the Latin American welfare state. And what we do in Latin America is we tax labor a lot through social security contributions and through labor taxes. We don't tax income enough. The most significant difference between Latin America and OECD countries is in income taxes, not in value-added taxes. It's in income taxes. We collect about 5 percentage points less of GDP in income taxes than the average OECD countries. If you fix the income tax, you have a big leeway. Now, the political economy of this is complex, but it points out, yes, partly the reason that you're such an unequal society is because you're not taxing the rich the way you should be taxing the rich, which is through the income taxes. You have very little resources. You deliver second-rate services, and the rest of the citizens say, look, I'm not interested in participating in this welfare state that is delivering me second-rate services and is not even going to give me a pension. So I'm out. In the Hirschmanian sense of exit and voice, I'm out. And that's what a lot of people are doing. So the fiscal dimension is essential to think in the same way that we think about the redefining of the welfare state. And that would bring another benefit. The other benefit would be that if you now do a big segment of social protection outside of the labor market through the mechanisms that you mentioned before, public health for everybody, citizen pension for everybody, income transfers outside of the labor market, then firms could grow, because firms could have much more space to actually hire, be less risky, and the cost would be less. And then firms, instead of being tiny firms, they could begin to be larger firms that could begin to create better jobs.
Now, what do we do in the international development community to facilitate this? Because it seems like the reaction that we talk about, the political economy, the reaction has been polarization, right? Growing leftist movements, left-wing governments like in Peru, people frustrated by the situation saying, yes, let's raise taxes, let's increase social services, but then a backlash from the right. And we look at Chile and the polarization there in their upcoming election. How can the international community support a just transition from a system that's quite regressive and unequal, that taxes labor more than income? But when there's not a lot of fiscal space, when the pandemic is still going on right now and maybe getting worse with this new variant, what can actually be done? What would your advice be to the institutions like where you worked at the Inter-American Development Bank?
So my sense is that the first thing that the multilateral development banks and international institutions like the IMF, the OECD, UNDP, the international community has to say is, we've got to be, I think, clear in stating in unambiguous terms that what is there is not working. And that little tinkering at the edges by fixing this little program here or that little program there is not going to solve the problem. The international community is not putting forth proposals that are commensurate to the size and depth of the Latin American problem. So the first thing is to actually change the nature of the debate and say to countries, look, we are not helping you if all I'm doing is I'm lending you $100 million for this or $200 million for that, and you do this little training program here, and then you do this little other education program over there, when the underlying infrastructure that we were referring to before is malfunctioning. And then the international community can say, look, I'm here to help you fix it. And let's chart a path. It can be gradual, little by little, but we all need to understand that if we continue to do the same, the result will be the same. Peru, that you mentioned just now. Peru is a very good example of a country that had excellent macroeconomic management, say between 2000 and 2019, before COVID. Income per capita actually almost doubled, not quite, but almost doubled in Peru. However, in 2019, before COVID, almost 80% of all Peruvian workers were informal. Almost 80%. And almost 80% of Peruvian workers were working on their own or tiny little firms. So growth was very much concentrated. So when we talk about GDP growth, well, that's grand and it's great, but that's the average. You have to think about the variance. And growth, what is happening in Peru is understandable, not desirable, but understandable on the face of what happened in the 2 decades before. And you can say the same for other countries that had relatively good growth. Dominican Republic, small country, people don't think about it very often, but similar situation. Very nice growth during 2 decades. Actually, they in fact duplicated income per capita. Informality went up in the Dominican Republic.
Because the gains from that economic growth really went to a high level elite. They went to the formal firms, the wealthy families, people already have assets. Yes. In a system where the taxation is pretty regressive, where you tax value-added labor less than you tax income.
Yes. And then you maybe use some of those resources to do some social protection programs that are perverse in the following way, right? And this is a feature of Latin America that other regions of the world should avoid. They say, oh, well, look, there are all these informal workers out there and they don't have health benefits. Let's create a parallel program to deliver health benefits for informal workers. And everybody claps, yeah, social spending is going up, social protection is being strengthened, fantastic. But then they say, well, let me think about it. So what you're doing now is you say, look, if you're informal, we give you health services for free. But if you're formal, we're going to charge you for health services. Let me see if I understand right. Did I get this right? So what you end up doing is you end up subsidizing informal activity. And if you go through the countries of the region, you see that anywhere between 2 to 4% of GDP is being spent on programs that have very good intentions, but that are actually subsidizing informal activity. And that is because they're caught in this dysfunctional welfare state that to begin with doesn't include everybody. And because it excludes half of the population, it say, well, let's patch this up. Let's invent something. And we'll call it strengthening social protection, and we'll give you all this. However, if you get a good job, we'll take it away. Huh? And if your firm gets more productive, we'll take it away. The incentives are all wrong, Rash.
The Biden administration is putting forward a $4 billion investment and effort in Central America, trying to address the root causes of migration. We talked to Roberto Jacobson a bit about this in our session with her. What do you think they should do with that money? What would be the right way to spend those kinds of resources, given how challenging the political situation is? We don't necessarily have good partners in all of those countries here in the United States. How would you think about spending that money in a way that could actually get at these root causes?
So if I was a person allocating those resources, I would not waste my time trying to promote that an American firm locates in Honduras, and we're going to try very hard that whatever textile firm or whatever auto parts firm locates, and we'll give you this tax benefit. And then, wow, we created 3,000 jobs. Look, it's fantastic. Through all these that's not going to solve the problem. We're talking about millions of workers here. So tackle the root of the problem. In Honduras, in Guatemala, in El Salvador, the labor markets are completely dysfunctional. Informality rates in Honduras and Guatemala are 70, 80%. So if I have $4 billion and I have a little magic wand, what I would do is say, look, I'm going to help you guys redesign your labor market and redesign your social welfare state. And what we're going to do is we are going to provide social protection because it is needed, definitely, but we're going to do it in a way that allows good jobs to be created in Honduras and good jobs to be created in Guatemala. And that's not happening. And I'm not talking about good jobs in terms of, we finally convinced Intel to set up a little factory here where they're going to put, whatever. And, 5,000 jobs, and we take the picture and everybody's fantastic, we're on the path. Yeah, sure. By the year 3000, you might finish. They're not tackling the problem. They're sidestepping it with things that are not going to deliver the results that they expect.
Yeah, and I'm sure for people following along, there are many examples like this across the region. I think of Haiti, lots of efforts to bring international firms there for relatively low-skilled jobs as a way to promote their economy. I mean, a lot of what you're talking about requires good partners in the region. It requires governments that have the vision you have, that want to engage in this way. What is your advice to the smaller international development institutions, the NGOs, the civil society groups, the people promoting democracy, freedom, human rights? How can they play a role here? Because ultimately, if we don't have responsible governments, if there isn't a sense of freedom in these countries, if there's a real stratification between elites, indigenous communities, and others, it seems like the program you're putting in place would require a different vision of the country that may exist in many parts of the region. So
the first thing I would say to all these people is thank you for all the work you do, because it contributes a lot, and these countries would be worse off without it. What I think is needed now is a rethinking of the NGOs and all the activities, not that it's within their power to do so, but it's within their power to communicate the need to do so. We're not at the point in which the region is recognizing that it has deep structural problems. We're not at an early 1990s moment. What do I mean by that? In the early 1990s, after the lost decade of the 1980s, everybody said, enough. This was terrible, enough. It's time to get macro right. It's time to get independent central banks. It was a consensus in the international community, the IMF, the World Bank, the IDB, academia, the elites, academia in the region. And then little by little, between 1990 and 95, over 5 years, 6 years, countries set the basis for all this. We're not there today. Hopefully COVID, of all the terrible things that it's brought, might end up creating an early 1990s moment in which NGOs and all these people in academia and everybody who's concerned about development in the region, plus, very importantly, the international community of developing institutions and the academic community say, enough. We're not going to continue tinkering at the edges with this little program here and this little program there. It is time to make a systemic proposal. And yes, you're right. Not all the governments are there ready to do so. But the ideas are not even put on the table. The first thing that needs to be done is to say, look, this is where we think, and then maybe one government here and maybe one government there. Take Peru again. So you have a new government. I don't know President Castillo. I don't doubt that he has the best of intentions. What he hasn't gotten is, all right, this is the path to go. You've got to change taxation, more income taxation, and you've got to redesign your welfare state. And because those ideas are not there, probably what might end up doing is the same recipes that we've tried before from leftist governments that we know haven't worked. We're going to raise minimum wages, which is going to even make it more difficult for people to join the formal sector. We're going to tax firms, not the rich. We're going to tax firms a little bit more, and then investment is going to be less, and that's not going to work. So I place a lot of weight on ideas. You're right that there are governments out there, that there's corruption, that there's political economy, that there are interests, but I place a lot of weight of ideas because Keynes says this at the end of the general theory. At the end of the day, ideas are what matter. And if the ideas and visions of the world, or visions of the region would change, maybe somewhere here or somewhere there or somewhere one government begins and then another one takes it up, and then it won't be pretty, it won't be easy, but at least there's light at the end of the tunnel. We're now not walking in the direction of the exit. We're still.
But sometimes we need an impetus for those ideas. I asked Luis Alberto and Roberto Jacobson the same question. I'll ask you, do you think we may see sort of an Arab Spring moment across the region of Latin America? I mean, prior to the pandemic, there were a lot of people in the streets in Colombia, in Peru, in Chile, in many places. Do you think we may get to that moment first before we get to this awakening that we need a new idea for the region?
It's a really good question. I'm not a sociologist, political scientist. Hard for me to tell. I do think that as long as these expressions of discontent are not violent, they're welcome. Because it's a way of saying, look, this is not working for half of us. Let's rethink. Let's go out of our complacency and stop repeating the formula. Yes, you need good macro, trade liberalization, invest in education, and everything will be nice. We've got to reflect that that's not enough. Not that it's wrong, it's just that it's not enough. And these manifestations in the streets, as long as they're not violent, there might be a way of triggering a rethink in the elites, in the international community, across the board, that look, this needs more than a little tinkering at the edge. This needs a real rethink, including, of course, the fiscal part that you mentioned before. We need to create hope. We need to create an avenue that has a probability of working. And we're not there yet.
Well, Latin America is definitely at a crossroads, and you have helped to, I think, lay it out so clearly and give us a vision for where it could go from here. I really thank you, Santiago Levy, for your time, for your ideas. It's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you.
On the contrary, Raj, thank you.
Well, I want to welcome Mario Arriagada from the Open Societies Foundations to the conversation. Nice to see you, Mario.
Great to see you, Raj. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, Mario. We're delighted to have you, and we appreciate the support of the Open Society Foundations for this series, the last of our 3 series on Latin America. You heard the conversation with Santiago Levy. I want to get your take. You're a senior program officer at OSF, and you focus on these issues of economic justice. What are your takeaways from that discussion?
Yes, well, it was a fascinating talk. So thank you for organizing all this. I mean, without you, all of these debates would never happen. And we need these debates to happen. As Santiago said, we can do more about sharing these ideas. And the challenges presented by the pandemic, I think, are an ideal opportunity for this. So thank you. I'll start by saying that, I mean, the risks that Santiago explained to us are pretty spot on. I think there's general agreement that inequality has gone worse in Latin America, which is the most unequal region in the world. Poverty went up because of the pandemic. There's differences between countries. I'll go into that, but it's a fact in general.
And perhaps that very inequality is the reason why the region has done so poorly when it comes to the health and economic consequences of the pandemic.
Exactly. That's a thought that is at the core of our idea on inclusive growth. And I think he said it really well when he pointed out that in the 80s, 90s, all the crises in Latin America made the whole region aware of the importance of macroeconomic policies and how that provided certain stability for the growth that came afterwards. But that model seems to have done what it had to do. And it came to a sort of a decreasing returns moment in which something like the pandemic showed us the structural problems, that the way that Latin America structured growth happened. And now we need to think about inclusive growth and a society less unequal and more prepared, not just to face crises like this one, and be kinder to those populations that suffer the worst consequences in shocks like this, but also to produce an environment for growth that is better distributed in terms of capital, in terms of opportunities, in terms of many things, public services, etc. Building that society is a new challenge for the region. So in that, I totally agree with Santiago.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating, especially in this moment where in a development community, we're thinking a lot about decolonization. We're thinking of the kind of history that has led us to the points that we're at. His reflection back on essentially the colonial history of the region and how it has led maybe to today to a model that just doesn't fit with the realities. This model that heavily taxes labor, but doesn't actually tax income and wealth, and that doesn't really address the deep inequalities that exist in societies and among marginalized people, among indigenous groups and others across the region.
Yes. On the taxing reform, I mean, fiscal space in Latin America is almost gone. So if there's any other crisis, the region would be in an enormously complicated position. So the way that taxes are collected is crucial. We rethink that, but also the way taxes are delivered. There are certain countries that are part of the OECD in Latin America. They're often compared how states do before collecting taxes and after deploying taxes through social policy in terms of combating inequality. And Latin Americans are really bad at that. There's certain states that are better at it, but the majority, it doesn't make much difference for inequality, the way you spend the money. It's done in a very regressive way. So that is in itself one of the many opportunities we have to try to think on a better redistribution, and not just in terms of cash, because that's one of the polemic ideas that came out of this episode of COVID, that through cash transfers, we can sort of make it better. And yes, we can, if you conceive those cash transfers and universal basic incomes as something temporary. Of course, they're very good to avoid falling under the poverty line for millions of people. The shocking comparison, for instance, between countries that did have this emergency cash transfer for everyone in a universal sense, they really stopped poverty from growing. A lot of families from not having enough to eat in the region. Brazil, with Bolsonaro unexpectedly, was one of those places. And Mexico did the opposite. They spent nothing on that, and poverty levels went up. Extreme poverty.
Where you sit right now in this conversation, you're based in Mexico City. Yeah, I guess the point there is the cash transfers and basic economic safety nets play a key role, but they're not sufficient to address long-term growth that's needed at the bottom of the income scale, right? Which is this question of informality. How do you get more people into the formal workforce? How do you make sure people are paid fairly for their work, basically, and get the public health services, pensions, or everything else that people who spend a whole lifetime working ought to get. You work on these issues at the Open Society Foundations. I'm curious, how do you go about trying to tackle this? What are your efforts look like when you go out and make your grant making and advocacy work in the region? How does it connect to these very issues?
Yes, well, we've chosen our own priorities. I mean, there's so many things that we could be doing, but you have to choose certain priorities. And we have chosen, for the moment in the region, I mean, we will revise this after sort of this madness ends. But we chose to focus on work, on the future work, on how the labor markets are structured, particularly on the care economy, and also on informality and informal work. And I'll go into that. And then, but finally, we have something on debt management. Perhaps we should get more involved on fiscal governance issues, crucial. But at the moment, it is debt that worries us in the foundation, not just in Latin America, in Africa as well. And we're trying to build a larger coalition that rethinks the way we manage debt internationally, how we renegotiate debt. In the 90s, there was this big jubilee moment. You might remember, Raj, or perhaps you're too young. But you remember Bono singing and sort of saying, let's forgive and forget this debt for poor countries. Well, what we think now is that debt, it's a useful tool if it's well regulated, if it's a tool for growth. But right now it's structured more as a business, and that can be very destructive for certain countries when they're in trouble. So we think that we have to restructure all that, and the foundation is doing a lot at the global level. But in specific terms in Latin America, so you know that youth and women were one of the most affected, vulnerable groups during this pandemic, because women take care of others without being paid and without having labor rights, and they often do it in informal spaces. So we thought, okay, there's already a very advanced debate, discussion, ideas, theoretical planning and thinking among some of our partners like ECLAC and CEPAL, some of the UN bodies, but also some universities, some wonderful feminist economists that were developing this idea of the care economy as something that has to be pushed forward in every country, and not just in countries, but also in district municipalities that have a lot to do with how women are rewarded for the work they do. So we're focusing on that a lot. And for that, we help feminist organizations at the moment to learn how to speak economics, not just understand the inequality, the inherited inequality and problems generated by patriarchy in terms of fighting for rights in a normative sense and in a legal sense, but also think of the system, the economic system that oppresses the majority of the population here, get engaged in these debates, make it yours, go beyond the rights logic and talk economic justice. And for that, we support them to do that transition. But we also support the networks of experts that are already working on care economy policies and specific pilots. And we've partnered during the pandemic. I mean, it's not something that we do often. We often work more with NGOs. But this time we've been working with local governments. So they deploy innovative public policies to improve care work and care systems in general in poor neighborhoods. It's a really complicated task. You have to map out who's doing the washing, who's doing the cleaning, who's doing the caring for the kids, who's caring for the elderly. And then you have to see whether that economic system in that neighborhood is efficient, whether they're lacking something, and help them with information, with planning, like this sort of small time economic planning that makes a big difference in the everyday life, and also facilitating ways of rewarding women in different ways. It's a really complicated question, but these pilots are emerging. And we believe that a care cities network, which we're also supporting, can really make a difference in exchanging experiences, learning from each other, basically bringing down the debate, the theoretical debate of care economy into practice. That's one of the key things we're trying to do. And just to wrap it up here, I'll just say that on informal work, I know it's one of Santiago's oldest passions, thinking how to deal with that. And of course, he's right when he says, well, let's give them public services and pensions and everything through a fiscal reform. I mean, we agree on that, but those are big words. And we would like to see them happen. But in the meantime, what do we do with informality? which is enormous in Latin America. It's actually
and that's where the work, Mario, on the care economy is so relevant, right? Because care economy is a huge percentage of the total labor force. It's all informal, basically, and many of these societies are grain societies. People are getting older. You have care needs for older populations as well as kids. It's a fantastic entry point into that economic debate about informality.
Yeah, and I think there's a further debate beyond care workers in particular, which you're right. There are millions, mostly women. They need help. But there's another way of saying the issue, which is the idea that formality means a good paying job with all the perks that we are customary. That idea, it's impossible to come to fruition in many contexts. So if we renounce to the challenge that informality has to transition into better forms of work, that working conditions are fundamental, that it's a whole range between informality and formality. It's not just one or the other. If we do that, we kind of stall ourselves in what we can do, because the impossibility of producing the ideal world is so that we need to think in terms of ranges. So problematizing informality, I think, is a first step. I think we've so far thought about it in the wrong terms. For instance, think of a food street vendor, someone that sells fruit, and you buy a little piece of fruit there. That person lives in a very violent working environment. The police goes after them every once in a while. They need to participate in some protection ring with other fruit sellers. The local authorities have very differentiated policies to deal with people selling things in this location or that location. It depends pretty much on the local political boss. And the life of the informal worker is very tough. How to improve their working conditions, it's also a way of tackling informality. I know Santiago, and this is one small difference I have with you. I mean, this is going to be, I shouldn't say this. I mean, how can I disagree with Santiago?
Please do. We want the debate.
Well, I think productivity is not just about formalizing jobs and growing the size of a firm. I think productivity is about technology and capital investment. I tend to go on that side. I know he also thinks that, but he bends a little bit the other side. I think productivity is not about whether people went to school, whether they know how to read, and then therefore we can expect productivity growth. It's more about technological change and investment, public and private investment in firms and strategic industries. And Latin America has been really bad, with certain exceptions, but in general, very bad at having a proper industrial policy that invests where it's convenient for their economy, where they're going to gain certain ground and involve people in better jobs. Also, I think private capitalism, like it's sort of creative capitalism in Latin America, is stalled as well. There's not enough private investment in their own countries. And whenever there's investment, it's not really technologically avant-garde. And there is the money. I mean, there is capital in Latin America. It's one of, they're mid-income countries with enormous capitals that need where to be put. And that idea of investment, I think it's more crucial for productivity growth rather than whether a worker is qualified. I think actually Mexico is one paradoxical example where years of study has gone steadily up in the last 15 years. And that has meant no productivity growth. So how do you explain that? Well, it has to be other factors. It's not really the workers or the informal workers problem or the size of their small firm. It's something else. And we also need to rethink that.
Well, you put, Mario, an important point on the table that we will continue to pursue in our coverage, a point of debate, and also, I think, an optimistic lens on the opportunity here, which is to invest. Think about this as an investment opportunity, even in people who are working in the informal sector, the care economy. There are a lot of opportunities here. This is not just a doom and gloom story about Latin America, as I hope has come out in all of our discussions through this series. Thank you, Mario Arriagada, for the conversation we just had now, for the support of the Open Society Foundations on these issues. It's been great to talk with you today.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you, everyone.
Well, I want to welcome back my colleague, senior reporter at Devex, Teresa Welsh. Teresa, nice to see you.
Thank you, Raj. Nice to see you too. Great conversations.
Yeah, what did you think? What were some of your key takeaways from these discussions that we just had?
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I mean, Santiago is just such a fantastic person to listen to, so dynamic, so many ideas. And I was just really struck by so many of the statistics he presented in terms of, really these challenges that the region has to overcome. One thing particularly as it pertains to informality, just that the massive amounts of the economy and the fiscal space that are taken up by informality and how you might go about overcoming that challenge, as well as the challenge of the taxation system and, placing this burden of taxation on, firms that is really a deterrent to moving towards the formality that we really need to see developing, and the hesitation of taxing the rich instead. And just sort of all the ways these issues are connected, and really paints just such a complex picture of the way forward in the region.
Yeah, the key word for me that comes out from both those discussions, Santiago and Mario, is really this word of transformation, right? I feel like we're in this moment, and Latin America is maybe more emblematic of it than other regions, where something fundamental has to give. We can't just kind of continue down this road for much longer. And the transformational forces are external in a way. They're things like climate or pandemic, but they're also these old structures that exist. And inequality is this kind of drip, drip, drip problem that really affects the lives of millions and millions of people every day. And eventually something has to give. And I thought, what Santiago was offering us, which was really hopeful in this discussion, was that there is another vision. There is another way we can look at these challenges, and that the development community following along here at Devex, they do have a role to play in investing in a new vision.
Yeah, absolutely. And, thinking a little bit about like, okay, what are the next steps? Like, how do you actually get this ball rolling? Because I think, we've all seen it's necessary, right? I don't think we have to make the argument that a change is necessary. I think we've all seen that that's the case. But, how do you actually take these steps when, we obviously talk about the region as a whole. There are differences amongst countries, different political realities, different situations happening in particular countries. But, how do you take learnings from one country to another? What role do institutions like the IDB play in that? How do they create sort of this environment, as you were saying, for transformation, and really encouraging people that this is what needs to happen? Because some of these are going to be tough political choices. I mean, when we're talking about taxation, particularly, no politician is really excited to tell their constituents that taxes are going to be going up, however that may be, whether it is on firms or on individuals or whatever. But as we've seen, the social protection systems also really need a transformation. These governments need to have the resources to provide what their citizens need, and they just don't right now.
And in many ways, these are big long-term issues, but they're also really urgent. And now, I mean, the conversation with Roberto Jacobson, our second in the series, she was President Biden's czar for the border for the first 100 days of the administration. And think about the role that migration is playing in the US political context and how that shifts so quickly. Think about all the millions of people in that region in the Northern Triangle suffering. And as Santiago described, like, these are issues right now. There's billions of dollars that are there on the table from the Biden administration to invest. And this is really a question for development professionals. The people who are part of the Devex community say, when you have that kind of money, you have this urgent need, what can we actually go do now? How do we invest in those community groups, those NGOs? How do we support the right kinds of government reforms? It's a big kind of theoretical economic question in a way, but it's really real and urgent and rooted in the reality of the daily life of millions of people right now.
Absolutely. And I think in the US, as you sort of alluded to, we have this unfortunate tendency for this to be wrapped up in our political debate, our political cycle, and all of that. And I think one of the major challenges will just continue to be for the Northern Triangle specifically when it comes to development. You have the Biden administration dedicating this money. He wants to spend $4 billion, $1 billion a year in the region. You're just not going to see the direct effects of that as immediately as anyone would like. That unfortunately just isn't the way development works in the region. You are going to need, you talk to experts, you're going to need a decade, maybe more, to actually bear the fruits of this. And when we're on a 4-year political cycle and the border remains such a hot button issue here in the US, it's really difficult to make an argument to sustain those programs and to make an argument that they're working when you don't have the data immediately. If you continue seeing these rushes at the border, if you continue seeing people that just are not able to meet their basic needs on a daily basis and they have to leave, it's their only option, it's really difficult to sort of make that argument that this is the best path forward. And obviously there are things that can be done in the short term, some interventions that can alleviate this more short term. I write a lot about food security issues. So obviously that's one huge thing, because that's a daily need people have. If you can't eat, what are you going to do? You're going to change your situation. You're going to find a way to make that happen. But I think that's, just going to continue to be, particularly from the US political context, really a struggle in how we think about development in the region, because it takes time. And I think that, we don't always want to give it the time that it takes.
And in our first of this series, where we spoke with Luis Alberto Moreno, the former president of the Inter-American Development Bank, he was really talking about, yes, the Northern Triangle is this urgent humanitarian situation. So is Venezuela, so is Haiti. But other countries are on the edge here. That the region is looking at significant debt. There's no fiscal space left at this point. The pandemic is not over. And this inequality question has been looming for years, and it's getting worse, actually, not better. So he was kind of raising the alarm bells to the broader development community to say, Latin America doesn't always get the attention maybe it deserves. Latin America is often, certainly in the United States foreign policy and foreign assistance context, it's often considered sort of a second tier set of issues. And I think he was really saying, look, this is the time to pay greater attention. Frankly, that's the reason why we at Devex put together this series of newsmaker events. We feel like Latin America deserves some attention, to be in the spotlight as a development community, whether you work there or not. It's a core set of issues across a diverse region, but a core set of central thematic issues that I think all of us have to grapple with in this community. And that's really why we brought this series forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was something that Roberta spoke about, when you had your conversation with her a couple of weeks ago, sort of making the arguments that she had to make as a US policymaker of like, this is our, Latin America doesn't like it when we say this, but this is the US's backyard. It's right here. We see the effects on our border in our own country. And, it's never really gotten the foreign policy attention. So that's obviously a very US centric view. But, the US policy has a huge role to play in the region.
It certainly does. Yeah. Well, listen, I want to thank you for your following along, being part of this, having these conversations, and everyone who's been a part of this, all of our newsmakers who join, and especially the Open Society Foundations for being our presenting partner for this series. This is just a beginning, maybe, or one in a long series of the coverage that we at Devex do on a range of issues. But I think you're going to see more from us on Latin America. We'll follow up on a lot of these stories. I'm glad we were able to sort of set the context, what's happening right now at this crucial moment, and at least start to point to what some of the areas of solutions might be that people in the development community are working on. So my thanks to all of you who have followed along with this series. We really appreciate it. Follow us on Twitter, subscribe to our newsletters, including Teresa's, Devex Dish, and stay tuned for more.